Welcome back to Crime Vault, where we uncover the darkest secrets hidden behind closed doors. I'm your host, and today I'm going to share with you a story that still haunts me to this day. It's a case that crossed my desk 3 years ago, and I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you about it. What you're about to hear is the true story of how a single text message unraveled a web of deception so complex, so twisted, that it led to one of the most shocking betrayals I've ever encountered. Pause. At 3:47 a.m. on September 15, 2019, a woman named Sarah Mitchell received 4 words that would destroy everything she believed about her perfect marriage. Your husband is cheating. But what Sarah discovered next wasn't just infidelity. It was a criminal conspiracy involving millions of stolen dollars, multiple identities, and ultimately, a murder plot that would chill you to the bone. But before I dive into this incredible story, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you who watch Crime Vault. Your support means everything to me, and it's what allows me to bring you these in-depth investigations week after week. If you're new to our channel and you enjoy deep dive true crime content, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It truly helps us grow and brings more stories like this one to light. Now let's get into the story that will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Let me paint you a picture of Millbrook Heights, one of those suburban communities where everyone knows each other, where children ride bikes on tree-lined streets, and where people still wave to their neighbors. It's the kind of place where you'd expect to find the American dream alive and well. And for 12 years, David and Sarah Mitchell seemed to be living that dream perfectly. I've studied hundreds of criminal cases, but there was something about the Mitchells that struck me as particularly tragic. Here was a couple that everyone in their community looked up to. David Mitchell was 41, tall, distinguished, with that kind of natural charisma that made people trust him instantly. He worked as a financial advisor at Premier Financial, and his clients didn't just trust him with their money, they trusted him with their futures. Sarah was 38, an elementary school teacher who had that rare gift of making every child feel special. Parents would specifically request her class for their kids. She had this infectious laugh that could brighten anyone's day, and she genuinely cared about making a difference in young lives. They met at a charity fundraiser in 2007. How perfect is that? 2 people dedicated to helping others, finding each other while doing good work. They married 2 years later in a ceremony that was talked about in Millbrook Heights for months afterward. Everyone said they were meant to be together. Their life had a rhythm, a beautiful predictability, that spoke of deep contentment. Every Tuesday morning, David would bring Sarah coffee in bed before heading out for his morning jog. Every Friday evening, you'd find them at Giuseppe's Italian restaurant, sharing dinner at table 12 by the window, Sarah's favorite spot. Every Sunday, they sat in the 3rd pew from the front at St. Mark's Lutheran Church. And afterward, they'd have lunch with friends and neighbors. For 12 years, this was their life. Stable, loving, enviable. Sarah trusted David completely. With her heart, with their finances, with their future. When friends would joke about checking their husbands' phones or being suspicious of late nights at work, Sarah would just smile. She never had those worries. Why would she? David was transparent about everything, or so she thought. But as I've learned in my years of investigating crimes, the most dangerous deceptions often hide behind the most perfect facades, and David Mitchell's facade was absolutely perfect. The first cracks began to show in small ways that Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on. David's phone, which had always been casually left on counters or tables, was suddenly always face down, always within his reach. His Tuesday morning jogs, which had been a consistent 45 minutes for years, started stretching to an hour, then 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. When Sarah asked about his longer exercise routine, David had a ready answer. He was training for a marathon. It made sense. David was the type of man who approached everything with dedication. But weeks turned into months, and he never seemed to actually register for any marathon. When Sarah mentioned this, he'd smile that charming smile and say he was still researching the best race for his HIST attempt. Then came the business trips. What had been occasional overnight meetings in nearby cities began expanding into 3-day conferences, weekend client retreats, and urgent consultations in distant states. David's calendar, which Sarah had shared access to throughout their marriage for coordinating their social life, suddenly became private. Client confidentiality, David explained. When Sarah asked why she could no longer see his schedule, "You know how strict the regulations are in financial services, sweetheart. I can't risk any appearance of impropriety." It sounded reasonable. David had always been meticulous about professional ethics. Looking back now, knowing what I know about this case, these changes seem obvious. But when you're living inside a relationship When you trust someone completely, you explain away the inconsistencies. You tell yourself logical stories about why things are different. Sarah did what most of us would do. She trusted the man she loved. September 15th, 2019 started like any other Sunday in the Mitchell household. David had returned the night before from what he called a client conference in Chicago. They'd had their usual dinner at Giuseppe's. David seemed relaxed, affectionate, telling Sarah about the boring presentations he'd sat through all weekend. They watched a movie together, went to bed at their usual time. Sarah felt that comfortable contentment that comes from 12 years of loving partnership. She had no reason to think this would be the last night she'd ever sleep peacefully beside her husband. At 3:47 a.m., Sarah's phone buzzed on the nightstand. In my years of investigating crimes, I've learned that life-changing moments often happen at the most ordinary times. Sarah almost ignored the message. Who texts at 3:47 in the morning? But something made her pick up the phone. The message was from an unknown number. Your husband is cheating. If you want proof, meet me at Riverside Park tomorrow at 9 p.m. Come alone, or you'll never know the truth. I want you to imagine receiving that message about the person you trust most in the world. Sarah told me later that her first reaction was anger, not at David but at whoever was playing such a cruel prank. Her second reaction was to wake David up and show him the message, so they could laugh about it together. But then something stopped her. Maybe it was the way David's phone had been glued to his side lately. Maybe it was those extended jogging sessions. Maybe it was a wife's intuition picking up on things her conscious mind had been refusing to acknowledge. Whatever it was, Sarah found herself staring at that message for a long time. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She lay there for 6 hours listening to David's steady breathing, studying his peaceful face in the dim light, filtering through their bedroom curtains. This was the man who'd held her through her father's funeral 3 years earlier. The man who'd surprised her with a puppy when they'd struggled with infertility. The man who'd built her a reading nook in their bedroom because he knew she loved to read before falling asleep. How could this man, her David, be deceiving her? Monday morning brought no relief from her torment. David seemed completely normal, kissing her goodbye with the same warmth he'd shown for 12 years, promising to pick up groceries on his way home from work. But Sarah found herself analyzing every gesture, every word, every expression. When he said, "I love you," did his eyes meet hers the way they used to? When he smiled, did it reach his eyes? The paranoia was eating her alive, but she knew she had to find out the truth. The alternative, living with this doubt forever, was unbearable. At 8:30 that evening, Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would change her life forever. She told David she was meeting her friend Lisa for coffee. The first deliberate lie she'd told her husband in 12 years of marriage. The words felt foreign on her tongue. As she drove toward Riverside Park, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. She was about to discover whether her marriage had been built on love or lies. Riverside Park at 9 p.m. was eerily quiet. Sarah arrived 10 minutes early, parking under a flickering streetlight, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. At exactly 9 o'clock, a figure approached her car. A woman in her mid-30s with auburn hair and eyes that had clearly been crying. The woman knocked softly on Sarah's window. When Sarah rolled it down, the woman said, "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, filled with pain and guilt. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "My name is Jessica Chen," the woman said. "I work at Thompson & Associates. We do marketing for financial firms, including your husband's company. I need to tell you something that's going to hurt you, but you deserve to know the truth." Sarah later told me that Jessica's first words hit her like a physical blow. But what came next was even worse. "I've been seeing your husband for 8 months, Jessica said, tears streaming down her face. "But Sarah, I swear to you, I thought he was separated. I thought you two were getting divorced. He told me you were living in the same house but sleeping in separate rooms while you worked out the details." Jessica had brought a folder with her, proof of everything she was claiming. Photos of her and David at restaurants Sarah had never been to. Hotel receipts from weekends Sarah thought David was at conferences. Text messages where David professed his love for Jessica, promising they'd be together openly as soon as his complicated divorce was finalized. But the most damning evidence was a collection of audio recordings. Jessica explained that she'd started recording their phone conversations when she began to suspect something wasn't right about David's story. "I've heard these recordings myself, and I can tell you they're chilling. Here's David's voice. The same voice that told Sarah, 'I love you' every morning, spinning elaborate lies about his marriage." In one recording, David tells Jessica, "Sarah's making the divorce so difficult, she's trying to take everything, the house, my retirement, even my business assets. I can't wait until this is over and we can be together without all this secrecy.
In another, I hate having to pretend with her.
Every day I have to act like everything's normal while inside I'm counting the minutes until I can call you. You're my real life, Jess. Everything else is just an act I have to maintain until the lawyers sort this mess out. The man on these recordings wasn't the David that Sarah knew. This was someone cold, calculating, manipulative, someone capable of living a complete double life without any apparent guilt or remorse. Jessica told Sarah how she'd discovered the truth. She'd decided to surprise David at his office with lunch, only to see him through the window kissing goodbye a woman who looked nothing like the bitter, estranged wife he'd described. Curious and suspicious, Jessica had followed them to Giuseppe's Italian restaurant. She watched from her car as David and Sarah laughed over lunch, held hands, acted like the loving couple they actually were. In that moment, Jessica realized she'd been as much a victim of David's deception as Sarah was. But Jessica had more to reveal, something that would transform this story from simple adultery into something far more sinister. What Jessica told Sarah next is something that still gives me chills when I think about it. Jessica hadn't just been David's mistress. Unknowingly, she'd been his accomplice in a massive financial fraud. You see, as their relationship had progressed, David had begun asking Jessica seemingly innocent questions about her work. Could she help him understand certain marketing strategies her company used? Could she share insights about client acquisition techniques? What seemed like a caring boyfriend showing interest in her career was actually corporate espionage. David had been using the information Jessica provided to manipulate his own business relationships, but it went much deeper than that. Through Jessica's inside knowledge of Thompson & Associates' client base, David had identified wealthy individuals and families who might be looking for financial advice. He'd use this information to approach these potential victims with investment opportunities that seemed too good to be true, because they were. David Mitchell, the respected financial advisor that everyone trusted, was running an elaborate Ponzi scheme. The scope of his crimes was staggering. Over the course of 3 years, David had stolen over $2.3 million from his clients. He'd created fake investment portfolios, forged documents, and used his position of trust to systematically rob the very people who'd relied on him to secure their futures. His victims weren't wealthy Wall Street investors who could absorb the losses. They were regular people, a retired couple who trusted him with their life savings, a young family putting money away for their children's college education, a widow who'd given him her husband's life insurance payout to invest for her future. The cruelest part was how David had used his relationship with Sarah to build trust with his victims. "Look at my wife," he'd tell potential clients. "Look at our life together. Our involvement in the community. Would someone like me ever cheat you?" He'd literally weaponized Sarah's reputation and their marriage to rob innocent people. But Jessica had even more devastating news to share. David hadn't limited his deception to financial crimes and adultery. There were other women, multiple affairs spanning years, each one built on carefully crafted lies about his marriage. There was Monica, a paralegal who thought David was a recent widower struggling to raise children alone. There was Amanda, a nurse who believed David's wife had abandoned him for another man, leaving him brokenhearted and slowly learning to trust again. There was Lisa, a real estate agent who thought David was going through an amicable divorce but needed to keep the relationship quiet to protect his children. Each woman had a different story, but all of them involved David playing the victim of circumstances beyond his control. He'd adapted his lies to each woman's personality, telling them exactly what they needed to hear to feel special, needed, and trusted. As Jessica finished laying out the evidence of David's crimes, Sarah faced an impossible choice. She could confront David directly, but what if he simply denied everything and destroyed the evidence? She could try to investigate further on her own, but what if she was discovered and David fled? Or she could do something that went against every instinct she had as a loyal wife. She could go to the police. Sarah told me later that this was the hardest decision she'd ever had to make. Despite everything she'd learned, part of her still loved the man she thought she'd married. Part of her wanted to give David a chance to explain, to make things right. But Jessica's evidence wasn't just about adultery. It was about serious crimes that had ruined innocent people's lives. How could Sarah stay silent when she knew David had stolen a widow's life savings? How could she protect him when she knew he'd robbed families of their children's college funds? The next morning, instead of confronting David, Sarah walked into the Millbrook Heights Police Department and asked to speak to someone about financial fraud. Detective Maria Santos, a 15-year veteran who'd handled complex white-collar crimes, listened to Sarah's story with growing amazement. Detective Santos told me later that in all her years of law enforcement, She'd never seen a case quite like David Mitchell's. The complexity of his deception, the number of victims, the calculated cruelty of his methods. It was unlike anything in her experience. Within 48 hours, police had obtained warrants to search David's office, their home, and all his financial records. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Hidden behind what appeared to be a solid wall in David's home office was a room Sarah had never known existed. Inside were multiple cell phones registered to fake names, fraudulent identification documents, detailed files on his victims with notes about their vulnerabilities and how to exploit them, and something that chilled investigators to the bone: detailed plans for disappearing permanently. David Mitchell had been planning to vanish. He'd acquired a fake passport under an assumed name, researched countries without extradition treaties with the United States, and had been systematically moving money to offshore accounts in preparation for his escape. The timeline investigators reconstructed suggested David was planning to disappear within 2 months. He would have left behind not just Sarah, but all his victims and the mounting evidence of his crimes. Sarah would have woken up one morning to find her husband simply gone. No note, no explanation, no forwarding address. David Mitchell was arrested at his office on October 3, 2019. I've seen the security footage from that day, and I have to tell you, it's fascinating to watch a master manipulator's facade finally crack. When Detective Santos approached David's desk and showed her badge, his face underwent a transformation that was captured perfectly by the office cameras. For just a split second, his mask slipped completely. The charming, confident financial advisor disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating and afraid. But David recovered quickly. Even faced with arrest, he immediately began trying to manipulate the situation. "There must be some mistake, Detective," he said with that same charming smile that had fooled so many people for so long. "I'm sure we can clear this up quickly." Even then, even caught red-handed with overwhelming evidence, David Mitchell was still playing a role, still trying to control the narrative. While David was being processed, Sarah faced 6 hours of police interrogation. Investigators had to determine how much she knew about her husband's activities. For Sarah, this was almost as traumatic as discovering David's crimes in the first place. Every aspect of her marriage was scrutinized. Every joint financial decision, every vacation they'd taken, every major purchase. All of it was examined for evidence of Sarah's potential complicity. The woman who thought she'd known everything about her marriage discovered she'd known almost nothing. The interrogation revealed the sophisticated methods David had used to hide his crimes from Sarah. He'd maintained completely separate financial accounts she knew nothing about. He'd intercepted mail and phone calls related to his illegal activities. He'd even created fake business documents to show Sarah when she occasionally asked about his work. Sarah had been living with a complete stranger who'd been skilled enough to fool her for over a decade. When news of David's arrest broke, it sent shockwaves through Millbrook Heights. The local newspaper ran the headline, "Trusted Financial Advisor Accused of $1 Million Fraud." Television crews set up outside the Mitchell house. Sarah, who'd spent her entire adult life as a private person dedicated to helping children learn, suddenly found herself at the center of a media circus. The community's reaction was split and brutal. Some people rallied around Sarah, understanding that she was as much a victim as anyone. But others whispered that she must have known something, must have been complicit somehow. How could a wife not know her husband was stealing millions? How could she not know about the other women? The judgment and suspicion from people who'd been her friends and neighbors for years was almost as painful as David's betrayal itself. As David's trial approached, the full scope of his crimes became clear. More victims came forward, people who'd been too ashamed or embarrassed to report their losses initially. The final count showed that David had defrauded 43 individuals and families of over $2.8 million. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh had built her career on complex financial crimes. But she told me that David Mitchell's case was unlike anything she'd ever seen. He wasn't just stealing money, she explained. He was stealing lives, dreams, and futures. He used his charm, his reputation, and his position of trust to systematically destroy the people who believed in him most. David's defense attorney, Marcus Reed, faced an impossible task. How do you defend someone caught with such overwhelming evidence? Reed's strategy was to paint David as a man who'd lost control, who'd made terrible mistakes but wasn't the calculating criminal mastermind prosecutors described. It was a desperate strategy that would ultimately fail, because the evidence showed that David's crimes were anything but impulsive mistakes. Every aspect of his deception had been carefully planned and executed over years. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Sarah took the witness stand. I was in the courtroom that day, and I'll never forget the scene. Sarah, composed but clearly struggling with enormous pain, faced the man she'd loved and trusted for 12 years. "I don't know who you are," she said, looking directly at David. "I thought I was married to someone else entirely. The man I loved would never have hurt innocent people. The man I loved would never have built our entire life on lies." David's reaction was telling. Throughout most of the trial, he'd maintained an expression of wounded innocence, as if he were the victim of some terrible misunderstanding. But when Sarah spoke, something shifted in his face. For just a moment, I saw what looked like genuine remorse, or maybe it was just regret at being caught. One by one, David's victims took the stand to describe how his crimes had affected their lives. Margaret Thompson, 78 years old, who'd lost her late husband's life insurance money and now had to choose between medication and groceries. The Rodriguez family, whose children would have to take out massive student loans because their college fund had vanished. Tom Bradley, a disabled veteran who'd trusted David with his settlement money and now faced homelessness. Each testimony was more heartbreaking than the last, and each one revealed David's cruel calculation in selecting vulnerable targets who had the most to lose. On the final day of testimony, something completely unexpected happened that I'll never forget. David Mitchell, who'd maintained his composure throughout the trial, suddenly broke down in a way that shocked everyone in the courtroom. It started when Prosecutor Walsh was presenting her closing argument, detailing the scope of David's deception and the lives he destroyed. As she spoke about his plans to flee the country, David began shaking his head, then muttering under his breath. His attorney tried to calm him, but David suddenly stood up and began shouting, "You don't understand. I couldn't stop. He was going to tell Sarah everything. He was going to destroy me." The judge called for order, but David kept talking, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of fear and desperation. What he revealed in those few minutes added years to his eventual sentence and exposed an even darker truth about his character. David hadn't been working alone. His business partner, Robert Hayes, had discovered David's fraud months earlier, but instead of reporting it, Hayes had decided to blackmail David for a larger share of the stolen money. Hayes knew about the affairs, the fake identities, the offshore accounts, everything. He'd threatened to expose David to Sarah and the authorities unless David gave him 50% of all future proceeds from the fraud scheme. But David's most shocking revelation was yet to come. In his final weeks of freedom, as the pressure mounted and his escape plan took shape, David had been contemplating something unthinkable: murdering Sarah. The words hung in the courtroom like a poison cloud. David Mitchell, the charming financial advisor who'd brought his wife coffee in bed every Tuesday morning, had been planning to kill her. Through tears and gasping breaths, David revealed that he'd researched methods of murder that would look like accidents. House fires, car crashes, medication overdoses. He'd considered them all. His motive wasn't just to escape justice, but to collect on Sarah's life insurance policy and start fresh with his new identity. I watched Sarah's face as her husband confessed to planning her murder. The color drained from her skin as she realized how close she'd come to death. The man who'd vowed to love and protect her, who'd held her through her father's funeral, who'd comforted her through every difficult moment of their marriage, had been planning to end her life for money. David's courtroom confession triggered a massive investigation that revealed the true scope of his criminal enterprise. Police seized his computers, phones, and financial records, uncovering evidence that painted a picture of premeditated murder. They found detailed research into various murder methods, including searches for untraceable poisons, how to stage accidental deaths, and life insurance investigation procedures. Most chilling of all, they discovered a timeline showing David had planned to kill Sarah within 2 weeks of when he was actually arrested. If Jessica Chin hadn't come forward when she did, if Sarah hadn't had the courage to go to the police, Sarah Mitchell might not have survived that October. The woman who'd loved and trusted David completely had been living with her would-be murderer, completely unaware of the danger she was in. The investigation also revealed that Robert Hayes, David's blackmailing business partner, had been planning his own escape. Like David, Hayes had been moving money offshore and had acquired false identification. Unlike David, Hayes had been smart enough to limit his direct involvement in the fraud itself, making him harder to prosecute. Hayes was arrested the same day David made his confession. Faced with the evidence against him, Hayes quickly agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. What he told investigators filled in the final pieces of the puzzle. According to Hayes, David's criminal activities went back much further than anyone had realized. The affairs, the financial fraud, even the fake identities. It had all been going on for over 5 years, not the 3 years investigators had initially determined. Hayes had discovered David's crimes by accident when he'd walked into David's office unannounced and found him on the phone with one of his fake identities, speaking in a completely different accent and personality. Rather than report it, Hayes had seen an opportunity for profit. The blackmail had escalated over months, with Hayes demanding larger and larger payments. When David finally realized he couldn't sustain both his fraud scheme and Hayes's demands, he'd begun planning his ultimate escape, one that included murdering his wife for the insurance money. On March 15, 2020, David Mitchell was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Patricia Williams called his crimes a systematic betrayal of trust that strikes at the very heart of our community's faith in basic human decency. David showed no emotion as his sentence was read. Even then, even faced with the destruction of his life and the lives of so many others, he maintained that cold, calculating demeanor that had allowed him to deceive people for so long. Robert Hayes received 20 years for his role in the conspiracy and agreed to pay full restitution to David's victims. Linda Morrison, David's secretary who had helped forge documents, received 10 years and was ordered to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations. But the criminal sentences were just the beginning. David's victims filed civil suits to recover their stolen money. And because most of David's assets were tied up in his marriage to Sarah, she found herself in the impossible position of potentially losing everything to help compensate her husband's victims. The house they'd shared for 12 years, her retirement savings, even her car, everything was at risk. Sarah had to hire her own attorney to protect what little she had left, creating an adversarial relationship with people who were as much victims of David's crimes as she was. The financial devastation was matched by the personal destruction. Sarah lost her teaching job because parents no longer trusted her around their children. She couldn't go to the grocery store, to church, anywhere in Millbrook Heights without people staring, whispering, judging. The woman who'd been beloved in her community became a pariah, suspected by many of knowing more than she'd admitted about her husband's crimes. Trauma experts say that spousal betrayal on the scale of David Mitchell's deception can be as psychologically damaging as physical violence. Sarah began suffering from severe PTSD, depression, and anxiety that required years of therapy to address. She couldn't trust her own judgment anymore. If she'd been so completely wrong about the man she'd lived with for 12 years, how could she ever trust anyone again? How could she trust herself to recognize deception, manipulation, or danger? Sarah's salvation came from an unexpected source: the other women David had deceived. Jessica Chen, Monica, Amanda, and the other women formed an informal support group they called the Survivors. They helped each other navigate the trauma of realizing they'd been completely deceived by someone they'd loved. Together they worked through the shame, the self-blame, and the crushing realization that their relationships had been complete fabrications. They learned that they weren't weak or foolish. They'd been targeted by a skilled predator who'd made deception his life's work. Recovery of the stolen money was only partially successful. Despite the best efforts of investigators and forensic accountants, about 60% of the stolen funds had vanished into David's complex web of offshore accounts and shell companies. Many of David's victims never fully recovered financially. Margaret Thompson, the elderly widow, had to sell her family home and move in with her daughter. The Rodriguez family's children took out massive student loans instead of using the college fund David had stolen. But some found strength in survival. Several of David's victims became advocates for financial fraud prevention, working to educate others about the warning signs they'd missed. It's been 5 years since David Mitchell's arrest, and I wanted to share with you what happened to the main people in this story. Sarah Mitchell has rebuilt her life, though it wasn't easy. She moved across the country, legally changed her name, and slowly began the process of learning to trust again. She now works as a victim's advocate, helping other people who've been betrayed by those they trusted most. Her experience with David, while devastating, has allowed her to help other victims in ways few people can. She understands the shame, the self-doubt, the feeling that you should have known better. Her work has become her healing. Jessica Chen became a fraud investigator, using her experience with David to help other victims of financial crime. She told me that helping catch other predators has given meaning to the pain David caused her. Monica returned to school and became a therapist specializing in trauma recovery from intimate partner deception. Amanda moved to Europe and started fresh, but she credits the support group with saving her life during her darkest moments. As for David Mitchell himself, he's currently serving his sentence at Federal Correctional Institution, Coleman in Florida. According to prison records, he's been a model prisoner, leading Bible study groups and mentoring younger inmates. Even knowing everything I know about his case, I find myself wondering if his apparent redemption is genuine or just another manipulation. Can someone who deceived people so completely for so long ever truly change? Or is he simply adapting to his new environment, the same way he adapted to every other situation in his life? Robert Hayes was released on parole after serving 12 years of his sentence. He now works in construction under strict supervision and has been ordered to pay restitution for the rest of his life. He's remarried and claims to have found religion, but given his history, skepticism seems warranted. Linda Morrison served her full sentence and was released last year. She struggled to find employment due to her criminal record and has largely disappeared from public view. David Mitchell's case has become a cautionary tale studied in law schools, business schools, and psychology programs across the country. His methods are now taught to investigators as examples of sophisticated criminal manipulation. But what can ordinary people learn from Sarah's experience? How can we protect ourselves from the David Mitchells of the world? Relationship experts who studied this case identified several warning signs that might help others avoid similar situations. Extreme charm that seems almost too good to be true. Secretive behavior about finances, technology, or schedules. Stories that don't quite add up when you think about them carefully. Most importantly, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, investigate. Don't let love, loyalty, or embarrassment stop you from asking hard questions or seeking answers. Financial experts recommend steps to protect yourself from people like David. Never give one person complete control over your finances. Verify credentials independently through official regulatory bodies. Remember that real professionals welcome questions and scrutiny, rather than discouraging them. Ask for references and actually contact them. Be suspicious of investment opportunities that seem too good to be true. They usually are. And remember, sophisticated criminals specifically target intelligent, successful people because they have more to steal. Perhaps most importantly, understand that victims of people like David Mitchell aren't weak or stupid. David's victims included teachers, doctors, business owners, and retirees who'd made smart decisions their entire lives. They were targeted precisely because they were trustworthy themselves and assumed others were equally trustworthy. The story of David and Sarah Mitchell forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, trust, and the masks people can wear. It reminds us that evil doesn't always look like evil. It can have a charming smile, a respected profession, and a loving family. David Mitchell sat in church every Sunday, helped his neighbors, participated in charity fundraisers, and seemed to embody everything good about community life. Yet behind that facade was a man capable of stealing millions from vulnerable people and planning to murder his own wife. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's Sarah Mitchell's message. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, investigate. Don't let love blind you to obvious warning signs. And remember, you are not responsible for someone else's decision to betray you. Sarah survived and rebuilt her life, but it took tremendous courage and the support of people who understood her experience. She wants other victims to know they're not alone and they're not to blame for trusting someone who seemed trustworthy. Cases like David Mitchell's remind us why channels like Crime Vault exist. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're warnings, lessons, and hopefully, tools that can help protect you and the people you care about. If this story has affected you, if you've experienced something similar, or if you suspect someone in your life might be deceiving you,